Okay, I would like to welcome everybody here today. My name is Robert Hux. Welcome the ambassadors and other representatives of diplomatic nations here. Some of you we recognize as having attended some events previously. Others of you don't know yet. One thing that we share in common is that the need to comprehend what's going on in the world in a new way. So before I go any further, I want to say a few things in terms of the format. We have a laptop computer here, as you can see, with a camera, so that our speaker, Hussein Askary, who I will introduce in a moment, can see the audience. So we are tape recording his presentation. Once his presentation finishes, we will stop the recording. So what happens after that is off the record. You don't have to worry about being quoted for what you say. So I think one thing that we can definitely say is that the world is at a very dramatic turning point. Even as the guns of war are beating harder and harder, there is a peace process which is gaining ground even faster. Just look at what's happened with the two Koreas. The presidents of North and South Korea declaring a peace treaty, bringing to an end the state of hostilities which has existed between the two Koreas since the beginning of the Korean War in 1950. This historic development, which heralds the potential for a new paradigm on the planet, was forged through the collaboration of three great powers: the United States under President Trump, China under President Xi Jinping, and Russia, which played a very large role under President Putin, creating the strategic geometry under which this could happen. These nations acting together have diffused a situation which only a few months ago was one of the most dangerous hotspots on the planet. The two leaders of North and South Korea, rather than continuing to act as pawns in a geopolitical game directed against China and Russia, have agreed to establish peaceful cooperation. They've agreed to reopen the Kaesong industrial development projects, and the Korean Peninsula is on track to be connected by rail to China's new Silk Road and to the Russian Trans-Siberian Railway. This proves that through diplomacy and goodwill, you can ensure peace on the planet. As Pope Paul VI said in the encyclical Populorum Progressio, development is the new name for peace. The other major development is the beginning of a new era of friendship between China and India, with Chinese President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi meeting at an informal summit in China for 2 days and reaching a decision to improve economic, political, and cultural relations. These are two of the oldest continuous cultures, over 5,000 years old. Each of them have made great contributions in poetry, music, and science, and philosophy. They represent together 40% of the world's population. Despite border conflicts in the past, they're now coming together. India and Pakistan are both members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Afghanistan is right next door. India and China are now coming together to connect Afghanistan into Central Asia and the New Silk Road. They are cooperating to build the China-Nepal-India corridor, which, in spite of the fact that India in the past has not openly supported the New Silk Road, this will in fact become part of the Belt and Road Initiative. What we are now seeing with these developments on the Korean Peninsula and the emerging new friendship between China and India is the potential for the emergence of what Lyndon LaRouche called for way back in 2007, which he called then the four powers, referring to the United States, China, Russia, and India. Mr. LaRouche emphatically warned at that time, this was at a conference in India, that the transatlantic financial system was on the verge of a historic crash, and that blowout would completely destabilize what had been the reigning hegemonic Western system. Mr. LaRouche said that the only way to avoid chaos and the danger of a world war would be to look at four major nations: the United States, Russia, China, and India. These are all different nations. They have little in common, but the one thing they do have in common is that they are all relatively powerful nations They believe in national sovereignty, and they believe in the necessity of scientific and technological progress. LaRouche said if these nations would act together, a new system for economic development, which other nations could join, could be created. And this would lay the basis for the Earth's next 50 years of economic development. Now, this was 6 years before President Xi Jinping of China announced the new Silk Road Belt and Road Initiative. This was 10 years before Xi Jinping, at the 19th Congress of the Communist Party of China last October, that China, which has lifted 700 million of their people out of poverty over the last 40 years, that China would completely eliminate poverty in China by 2020, which they are well on the way to doing, as there are now only 30 million poor people left in China. He also said that by 2050, that China would become a strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious, and beautiful nation. And that by that time, China would also have become a fully active member in the community of nations. China, under Xi Jinping, has formed a very close relationship with Russia's President Putin. The new Silk Road is being integrated with the Eurasian Economic Union, which was launched by Russia. The United States President Donald Trump has dropped his China-bashing talking points of his campaign, and he's committed to building a strong friendship with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. And the more that Trump is attacked by the now totally discredited Russiagate lies promoted by the British-tied fake media, the more he reasserts his intention to improve relations with Russia. So the war party is hysterical. The financial district of London, England, known historically as the City and also Wall Street, know that their financial bubble is ready to pop. The toxic debt is 40% bigger than in 2008, and nothing has been done in the transatlantic sector countries to solve the problem, and everyone knows that. So the unipolar world crowd needs conflict. Whenever there's a major financial crisis in their system, they go for war as a cover to maintain their power. So that brings us to where we are today. Today is May 8th, a special day in Europe. The 73rd anniversary of Victory in Europe Day, which marks the end of World War II in Europe. On this occasion, our chairwoman and founder, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, wrote a short statement, which I would like to read a part of you for, before I introduce our speaker. Copies of the entire statement in English and French are available outside at the literature table. So here is Mrs. LaRouche. But their power is diminishing as they have increasingly been forced to act in their own name, thereby exposing themselves. Their ability to keep control has also been diminishing due to the challenge from the new Silk Road and the new paradigm that it represents. In the last weeks, diplomatic and economic events and summits have greatly advanced the new paradigm. The strategic partnership between Russia and China and the integration of the Belt and Road Initiative and with the Eurasian Economic Union have created hope for especially the developing countries. We see the chance to overcome poverty and underdevelopment for the first time. The best way to commemorate the losses, the suffering, and the heroism of the individuals who lost their lives in the Great Patriotic War is by creating a new era of mankind, which puts the concept of the one humanity first. In that way, creating a new international order which overcomes geopolitics forever. Imperialism must be defeated as a relic of a bestial image of man and be replaced with the noble image of man, a species known universe so far. Let us celebrate the future spirit of humanity, which is so beautifully expressed in the Ode to Joy of Friedrich, the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven. All men become brethren. Be embraced, ye millions yonder. Take this kiss throughout the world. Brothers, over the stars unfurled, must reside a loving Father. Helga LaRouche, Chair, Schiller. Speaker tonight, Hussein Askary, who has worked very closely with both Lyndon and Helga LaRouche. As you know from the invitation, is one of the two co-authors of the Schiller Institute Special Report that we have copies of on the desk outside. He's also the editor of the Arabic language edition of Executive Intelligence Review. And for nearly 20 years, he has written about the politics, economics, history, and culture of many of the countries in West Asia and Northern Africa. Hussein's Arabic translation of the 360-page EIR Special Report, as for example, it's being studied closely by the Egyptian Transportation Ministry and leading intellectual and political layers in Yemen. So join me in welcoming our speaker, Hussein Askary.
Thank you very much, Robert, for this nice introduction. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be speaking to you today in this esteemed gathering. I'm speaking to you from Stockholm. I'm an Iraqi Swedish citizen. As Robert said, I have been working with the Schiller Institute and Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche for the past 22 years. I would like to start my presentation with contraposing these two images in the first slide. The first one to the left from 2015 is a true image taken by NASA satellites by nighttime. And you see that the darkness is shrouding Africa and West Asia. The other image from 2050 is inspired by the report we have put together recently. And the quote from Mr. Lyndon LaRouche says, "The future determines the present," because we believe that history is not made by events following each other, where event 1 creates event 2 and event 2 creates event 3. But the history of mankind has been shaped by ideas and visions of what kind of society and what kind of world we want to have. So if this is the basis, if this is our vision for the future we can agree on, then we have to look at what we call the bill of materials, what we need to realize this vision. This is what we have on image 2, which is the cover of our report, the front and back cover of our report. And in this report, we explain how this vision can be achieved. The other inspiration for making this report I wrote together, of course, with my colleague Jason Ross and a team actually of the Schiller Institute. And as we see in the second slide, our other inspiration source is that we have a new paradigm emerging in the world. While, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche describes this paradigm vis-a-vis the old paradigm, which is dominated by British geopolitics, it's dominated by the idea of a zero-sum game, where the relations between nations is based on fighting over limited resources, where the powerful dominate the weaker nations and use military force to get their will through. And that includes violating the national sovereignty of nations and international law. The new paradigm, which is exemplified by the BRICS nations, is based on the equality between the perfectly sovereign nation states, where there are no limited resources, but resources can be created using scientific and technological progress. And the powerful help the weaker nations to rise up to become equals. That's the idea of the win-win philosophy. In the next slide is just very quickly, this is Mr. Lyndon LaRouche's forecast of why the transatlantic financial and economic system would collapse. This was presented in 1995 and it explains that in the Western world, in the formerly industrial nations, emphasis since the early 1970s have been on making more and more financial and monetary benefits. And that's why we have now the big crisis, which erupted in 2008. But the infrastructure of Europe and the United States have been in a downturn for more than 30 years. So Mr. LaRouche's idea was that we have to turn this trend upside down, where we put emphasis on physical economic development. And on a global scale, like in we have in next slide in 5 is we have to integrate the infrastructure networks of each nation and each region and all continents together using modern infrastructure technology. The Schiller Institute presented this already after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We used to call it the Eurasian Land Bridge, and then it developed into the World Land Bridge. In 1996 until 2013, when the Belt and Road was announced, this became a Chinese official strategy, as we see in the next slide, number 6. And as you see in this slide number 6, you have the economic belt of the Silk Road, which is in the red lines, which was announced by President Xi Jinping in Astana in Kazakhstan in September 2013. And the next month in Indonesia, he announced the creation of the Maritime Silk Road. So the ideas of what the Schiller Institute had presented earlier and the idea of the Belt and Road, they converge in this sense. So in the next slide, we come to the area which we call West Asia or Southwest Asia. I don't like the term the Middle East. I will explain that if you want in the discussion period. We call it West Asia. So this area was identified by Mr. Lyndon LaRouche in a visit to Abu Dhabi in 2002 as the crossroads of the continents. And it's, as everybody admits, this is the most strategic area in the world. And also the existence of the largest petroleum reserves also have made it even more important. But this region has been an area of conflict for more than 100 years. Due to the geopolitics which were practiced by the big powers, but also because of internal dynamics of these societies in the region. But in any case, our idea was that if there would be peace in this region, it should be based on economic development and not simply on political agreements. Of course, the conflict should be stopped, the attack on Syria, sovereignty, by Western-backed groups, the genocidal war in Yemen, which is launched by Saudi Arabia and the United States and Britain and their allies, that should stop. Iraq should be strengthened to fight against terrorism. And finally, we should end this eternal tension with Iran. And I hope President Trump will not do anything terrible by withdrawing today from the nuclear agreement, because that would be a big, big mistake. So, of course, that's a prerequisite, but what would follow that should be the idea of bringing nations together on economic development and mutual benefit. And this is what, as we see in slide number 8, the next one, this is what President Xi Jinping brought to the region in January 2016, when he visited Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Iran in the same week. And he presented the idea of bringing these nations together with the idea of connecting these nations and the whole region to the new Silk Road strategy. And in that way, relieve the tension which exists by making nations realize that they have common interests. And of course, presented China's readiness to help these nations with infrastructure projects, power, transport, even nuclear power, and so on. And we, in 2014 and 2015, we actually, a colleague of mine here and a delegation from the Schiller Institute visited Syria and presented the next slide. We have the Operation Phoenix on Syria's reconstruction. And that policy was actually adopted by the Syrian government. In the next slide, we have the advisor to President Bashar Assad, who visited China in November 2017, last year, and pronounced Syria's readiness to work with China on the Belt and Road, and asked for China's participation in the reconstruction of Syria. And Chinese and even Russian companies are now actively discussing projects with the Syrian government. So on the next slide, we have a picture of my colleague, Ulf Sandmark, who's working here with me in Stockholm with Dr. Shaban and an advisor to the government. So that idea is now, the idea of extending the Silk Road to this region is very, very widespread, and many governments have welcomed this idea. So we have Turkey, Iran, even Saudi Arabia, are joining. And Egypt, of course, is a key country in the connection between Asia and Africa and the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. And so Egypt is also participating actively in the Belt and Road project. So this brings us to the next slide, which is our main focus actually on Africa. There is no lack of vision, as you see in this chart number 12, is this map. It was produced already in the 1980s after the Lagos plan by the African countries. This is a plan for building trans-African highways for cars. But this and many other visions were never realized because the African nations themselves, who just came out of colonialism, did not have the tools to build them. And those nations in the industrial world who had the tools, were not interested in providing these tools to the African nations, because the attitude towards Africa was that Africa is a major source of raw materials. That's it. But China and other countries working with China have changed that idea. In 2017, there was a famous report by the McKinsey consulting company, which showed how China is working in Africa. And it showed that China is now the greatest trade partner, the #1 trade partner with Africa, and the biggest builder of infrastructure in Africa, the biggest donor of aid. But there is one irony, as you see in the next slide, number 13. China is not the biggest investor in Africa. The United States is #1 and Britain is #2 in investments, foreign direct investment in Africa. And although as you see in the blue curve, which is US foreign direct investment in Africa, it has been declining under Obama actually until zero. There are many explanations we have in the book for that, but still, the Chinese investments, they continue to go upwards. But as you see in the dotted curve, the total amount of investments in 2015 was still, the United States was much higher than China. The same thing goes for Britain. But when we look at where the United States and Britain are investing, then we understand in the next slide why it maybe looks a bit too many complications. But one major issue is that US foreign direct investment is mainly concentrated on mining, while the Chinese investments are diversified. And in the next slide, you have, this is British foreign direct investment in Africa between 2005 and 2014, the same period. The last two ones, which are colorful, is a breakdown of the kind of investments being made. The red color represents investments in mining, and the blue, the light blue, is the financial services, banking, and so on. But that's mainly it. And then the dark blue is the money going out of Africa to Britain. So that's where the United States and Britain are investing. We will skip the next one, number 16. It refers to the same things. But the number 17 is the US Export Bank loans to Africa and China's Export Bank to Africa. You see, US loans go mainly to mining companies. The Chinese Export Bank goes to, the largest portion goes to transportation sector, and then the mining, of course, 29. It doesn't mean that China is not interested in raw materials in Africa, but it shows that China is offering other things than just taking raw materials from Africa. So you can see many such examples, which shows that the accusations against China, that China is in Africa for raw materials, is actually the United States and Europe looking in the mirror, looking at themselves rather than looking at China. And we discovered many falsehoods. In the next slide, number 18, you have this, in 2008, we had the biggest, one of the biggest food crises in the world in recent years. And right there, you had a flood of articles which says that China is invading Africa to produce food for China. we took this special article from 2009 from The Guardian, which people say is a respected newspaper. Under the picture, you have this statement which says, 1 million Chinese farmers have joined the rush to Africa, according to one estimate. Above the picture, the estimate The Guardian refers to is a report by the Food and Agriculture Organization. This is a link to the document itself. So we clicked on the document and we read the document, and we couldn't find any million Chinese there. And the next slide, this is what the report says about China and Africa. And it says, however, and this is the conclusion, however, as yet, there are no known examples of Chinese land acquisitions in Africa in excess of 50,000 hectares. China's friendship farms in various African countries are formally owned by a Chinese parastatal organization. It says, but are mostly medium scale, usually below 1,000 hectares. So the report, which The Guardian refers to, says nothing about 1 million Chinese farmers moving to Africa. But as is usual in the fake news industry, what people will remember is the 1 million farmers. The readers of The Guardian would almost never click on the document and read 90 pages of very dry statistics, very boring. They just believe in The Guardian because it's a respected newspaper. So we looked for who really is land grabbing in Africa to put it in our report. And in slide 20, we quote from this report, which is financed by the EU itself. Yeah, it's produced by Friends of Earth who visited Africa for field studies. And what the discovery is that the land grabbing in Africa is mostly done by British companies, number one, Scandinavian companies, and Brazil. And what these companies produce, they use the land and water of Africa to produce biofuels. They produce plants like jatropha and sugarcane, and they produce biodiesel for cars in Europe out of that. So that's the reality of what they accuse China of. So anyway, we move to the next step, which is how we can deal with Africa in this sense. How could Europe or the United States deal with Africa? And that means we have to change the attitude towards Africa from helping to empowering Africa. And that was actually the idea of the American president, Franklin Roosevelt, in his fights with Winston Churchill during their meetings under World War II. Because he said to Churchill, you are sucking the blood of Africa and you get just pennies. But if you develop Africa the way we developed the United States with building infrastructure, sanitation, you would gain much more through fair trade. And therefore, he said, after the war, there will be no British or French or Belgian empires. And unfortunately, President Roosevelt died before the war ended. And the people who replaced him were Anglophiles who loved the British Empire more than the American Republic. And the United States became the muscles of the British Empire. So anyway, the attitude towards Africa continues today, as we see in the next slide, that Africa is associated with famine, wars, poverty, and so on and so forth. And it's a big burden, but what shall we do? We have to help the poor Africans. So this Safe Water Africa is a European operation, which is typical. You have organizations in Europe and in the United States, including the United Nations organization. They make these small projects all over Africa. And people in Europe, citizens, they can pay $100 or $200 to these organizations to help the poor Africans have some clean water. And then they can claim we are trying to help Africa. But if you look carefully at this picture, what it tells you is that these women, they will continue walking for many kilometers, maybe every day, to the pump, carrying these very heavy tanks. Imagine how much, if you fill these tanks with water, how heavy they are. So what I understand from this image is that these women and their daughters will forever continue walking from their houses to this pump to carry water back and forth for years to come. What we should be doing instead, or the Africans should be doing, is you have to bring the water to the houses of these ladies by pipes, and better built houses. But that requires enormous investments in infrastructure, in mega projects, dams, water canals, and things which the Europeans and the United States don't wish to build in Africa. So anyway, the other attitude, which is we see in the next slide, says that, well, Africa should get technology, but it should be so-called appropriate technology. Not nuclear power, not hydropower, but maybe some small solar cells so people can charge their mobile phones. Because Africa should not make the mistake of industrialization, as many politicians in Europe and the United States say. I usually hear politicians say Africa should not do the same mistake we made in Europe by industrializing. I would like to use this video clip from President Obama's visit to South Africa in 2013, if you can play it. What President Obama was trying to say is that African youth, they should not think about having a house, a car, and air conditioning, because if every African has a house, a car, and air conditioning, the world would boil over. And that's pretty much what he says. This is going to be US policy. We will not let you have a house, a car, and air conditioning. Okay, so, but in the next slide, we see President Obama's new house in Washington, which is worth $8 million, which is a beautiful house. You can see the next slides. There's nothing wrong about it. I wish to have a house like this. But to tell Africans that they should not have a house like this, that's not nice. So this is the attitude of the West, and it's not simply Obama. This is the attitude of almost all Western policy towards Africa. In the next slide, we see President Xi Jinping in the same place in Johannesburg, in the China-Africa Economic Forum. And what he said there, in total contrast to President Obama, he said, I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can read the quotes in the report itself, but he says industrialization is the key to development. This is how we managed to have a miracle in 30 years. And he told the African leaders, it's completely possible for Africa to do the same thing we did in China, which is industrialization. That's the way out of poverty, not so-called appropriate technology or so-called. So anyway, if we go to the slide number 31, we are back into the idea of the Belt and Road and how it's extended to Africa. In the slide number 32, we have the Prime Minister of China in East Africa, after visiting West Africa, offered to help connect all the African capitals with high-speed railway and modern railways. And the next slide, we have the same map of connecting the African highways. Now is possible to connect with high-speed railways. And within 3 years of the speech by the Chinese Prime Minister, we see in the slide, the next slide, 34, we had the first railway getting online in Ethiopia. And that's, as we see in the next slide, is not a Chinese project. This is part of an Ethiopian national development plan. It includes connecting all the cities of Ethiopia with modern railway and building industrial parks all over the country. So China is not imposing the Silk Road on these nations. It's providing the tools for these nations who already have ideas and visions. African nations, as we said, since the liberation, they have had their ideas, but they lack the tools. In the next slide, we have the inauguration of the Mombasa-Nairobi Railway. Also last year, it took only 3 years to build. This is part of an old plan which the East African nations had to connect all the East African countries with railway. The next slide, we have the connection of Angola to Zambia and Tanzania, which was also accomplished with China's help, replacing a very old British railway. In the next slide, we have Egypt building a new Suez Canal. This was not a Chinese project, it was an Egyptian project, but it is motivated by the Belt and Road development. In the next slide, we have the idea to build the Trans-Aqua water project. It is both to save Lake Chad, which is shrinking, but also building navigation canal and transport and power generation projects. The idea was to build a 2,600-kilometer canal and take a small portion of the water from the tributaries of the Congo to move to the Lake Chad. And the Schiller Institute have been lobbying for this project for many years, but the project was, or the idea originally is of an Italian company, Bonifica, but we were trying to push up European nations and the United States to help build this project, but the EU rejected the idea. Until we helped, actually, the Schiller Institute helped bring the Chinese company called Power China, and they agreed together with the Italian company to start feasibility studies for this project. And of course, the nations of the region would have to agree to this idea, not the Italians or the Chinese, because this is, as we see in the next slide, this project will become the centerpiece of all developments in Africa. And the breakthrough came, as we see in slide number 41, the next one, in February in Abuja, Nigeria, this last February. And the countries of the Lake Chad Commission agreed, the leaders of the Lake Chad Commission agreed that the Transaqua, our project, is the only solution to this problem of the Lake Chad. And therefore, discussions will start now with the Democratic Republic of Congo on this issue, because the water will be emerging from the DRC. So in this conference, we had, in the next slide, you see some of our members who were invited to Nigeria, Sebastian Permoni and Claudio Celani from Italy, who presented copies of the report I'm discussing now with you to the Vice President of Nigeria and other leaders of the different African countries. Yeah, anyway, we just go through some of the projects we propose in our report is connecting Europe to Africa also, because we do want Europe involved in these projects, not only China. And in slide 43, the next one, we have the next project is connecting Italy to Tunisia. We also propose in the next slide to integrate the waterways of Africa through building canals between the rivers of Africa, similar to the European Danube Rhine Canal, which goes all the way from Eastern Europe, from Romania to Holland. A very important transport artery for whole Europe. Similar system can be built in Africa itself. And in the next one, we propose active work on building the Grand Inga Dam on the Congo River. This will produce 40,000 megawatts of electricity for not only the Congo, but many countries in the region. China is interested in helping build this project, but as soon as China announced that, the World Bank withdrew its support to this project. I mean, the bank was not going to build the project, but they had some technical support, which now they even withdrew that. We also, in the next slide, we encourage the nations of Africa to immediately establish nuclear energy organizations or agencies. Some countries do have active programs, like South Africa. Egypt now is also building the first nuclear power plant with Russia.
I didn't understand you saying why the World Bank is against Grand Inga.
Well, they're against all mega projects. They withdrew their support to the whole idea, but that doesn't really matter, because the idea was not to build the Grand Inga Dam. The idea was to be there to make sure it is not built, because as soon as it was getting close to realization, they didn't want to be part of it.
No.
Yes, Egypt has an active nuclear power program now. They are building the first nuclear power plant in cooperation with Russia. Algeria has a nuclear program. Even Ethiopia is contemplating a nuclear program, because that's really the power source of the future. So anyway, we have many proposals in the report on the integration of the African infrastructure, and also, of course, agriculture, scientific research, and so on. So we don't have all the time, but we have all the the methods and tools described to reach this final vision, which is in the final slide. So that's generally what I wanted to say. What is important is to focus on shifting the concepts about economy, about technology and industrialization, because without getting the ideas, it's very difficult to start working on the practical things. Thank you very much.
Thank you.